Today we're at the British Museum returning for our third trip. We're going to be starting with the British section, looking at some Viking and European, looking at some pottery, some sketches, and the Asian galleries covering China, Japan, Korea in particular, and India. So here, this is the Sutton Hoo hoard, and I know we covered it slightly in an earlier video, but this is really gorgeous. It's one of the highlights of British archaeology, and it's often quite busy. It's one of the kind of 10 must-see items. This one's a reconstruction of the helmet, but you can see the original on the corner, and all of this came from a longboat in Sutton Hoo, which you can still visit, but the boat itself was pretty corroded, and it was sort of more the outline of the boat than the actual wood. And what's been left has been reburied. The mound has been repaired and replaced, but the finest items are on display here. And you can see the Anglo-Saxons weren't the wild barbarians they might sometimes be portrayed as. They had beautiful European silverware, the magnificent helmet, some gorgeous items of gold that we'll see in a second. And here, various bowls and everyday implements on the boat. It's all displayed in this beautiful two-sided case with a lit glass outline in the middle. And here's some of the ironware, pieces of armour, pieces of shielding and weaponry, which has obviously corroded. But this isn't a replica, these are genuine. This is the belt, the beautiful gold and jewel encrusted belt, brooch, some coins he was buried with. And obviously we know little about him. Here's the bands from some drums of water or liquid storage. Some beautifully recreated pieces here. We have the tuning pieces from the lyre, and then they've reconstructed what the original would have looked like. The same with the drinking horns. We have here the decoration for the drinking horns and for the wooden jugs with decorative metalwork, but they've recreated them so you can see what they were like. And obviously this wasn't a poor man. This was probably a chieftain or a king of his area. This is reconstructed from a very damaged piece. It's a cauldron. It would have been a typical cooking cauldron. And here the casp from a purse. Just absolutely gorgeous. Little bit of shine and it looks like new. You can see where pieces of leather are missing and have rotted away, but just the detailing and the intricacy of this beautiful piece is just wonderful. And it shows that these weren't the Dark Ages, these weren't savages, these were people with a sophisticated structure and hierarchy to society, and either a command of great metalwork or the ability to purchase it. And here, a sword and scabbard, what's left of his shield, and here the small fragments to the left of the famous Sutton Hoo helmet. Next table over is a rather glorious hoard that was dug up from Viking times. Beautiful silverwork and metalwork. Around the wall here are items from the Viking period, particularly in Britain. You can see the axe head there, great big sword and spear, pieces of jewellery, measuring scales. I loved in this corner, this is bone carved intricately, inscribed with runes, and the beautiful horse head motif at the top, along with silverware, ironware. Here there's a thistle, which was an Irish emblem adopted by the Vikings, and you can see brooches, decorations, tongs, even bowls. beautiful pieces from the Viking ages. And here a necklace, a sort of decorative necklace, not really what you'd think of as a necklace today, but for a high-ranking lady, a beautiful enhancement for her robes. And a series of everything from riding stirrups and items to do with horses and coins, jewellery, decoration. Really interesting pieces here. A few years ago there was an exhibit of the Vikings at the British Museum, and it painted very much an image of the Vikings like those horse motifs up there. These were, I don't want to say they weren't savage, they were pretty savage if they wanted to take your money, but they were a sophisticated group. And here, look at these. If we just go close up, you can see how beautiful these brooches are. Then next room over is some wonderful examples of pottery, particularly Wedgwood. You can see some jasper wares there. There's a blue jasper vase. The Portmeirion vase is here somewhere. A lot of pieces of amber and pottery, jewellery, decorative pieces, cameos. It's an interesting selection. If you're really into jasperware and Wedgwood, then you need to check out our video on the V&A's Wedgwood collection at Barlaston in Staffordshire. But there's a very decent selection here of 17th, 18th, 19th century, particularly Wedgwood, but there's also quite a few other pieces. And there, lovely vase, really wonderful. I think we've seen that Portmeirion vase at 3 museums so far. If you check out the Fitzwilliam Museum video, you see a particularly good example for photographing. Here, this is actually pottery, even though it's gilded and looks like it's made of gold. It's actually a beautiful piece of pottery, along with some very ornate pieces, decorative pieces, items for commemorative of events. You can see they're interesting. A sugar bowl for slave-free sugar, and a small plaque there commemorating the Peterloo massacre in Manchester. Here, a series of seals. So if you have a university gets permission to be university, they get a large document which says you can be a university, or you can build this bridge, or this royal association, and it has a seal from the king and the series of them. That's a death mask of Napoleon Bonaparte, along with some beautiful pieces from the same era. The small gilded box there was actually a gift by Napoleon to an English lady, because the lady and the lord were very supportive when he was negotiating a treaty in Italy, I believe after the Battle of Borodino, and he gave them that in his will as a thank you. There's recognisable immediately Lord Byron, Mad, Bad and Dangerous to Know, along with some blue porcelain when the British were beginning to copy the Chinese styles. Some lovely examples of jewellery from Britain and around the world in terms of particularly use of precious jewels, silver, gold. Very detailed pieces. Here I say the pottery doesn't attempt to be a complete coverage. The way much of the British Museum is a complete coverage of a particular theme within a cabinet. Say where there was the cabinet in my last video on gladiators, there's sort of everything to do with gladiators, a little bit of everything. Here, these are the finest. They're examples of the finest of jewellery and porcelain, cameos, even decorative shells down there. Some tile decoration here. We'll actually see some better examples, particularly Minton and Moores, later on in this video. Lovely. I do like those 4 tiles down there. This sort of classical age encapsulated as a modern artwork. Very much the vogue when the British Museum were building their collection. We're going to flit around this gallery a little bit. It has a large collection of European pottery, but if I just choose a few pieces here, I love these beautiful Gothic revival tiles at the bottom, very much in the style of Pugin. When Catholicism was legalised in Britain, there was a revival of medieval style but with modern manufacturing. The same as the classical tiles we saw earlier. These very much could be from a medieval monastery, and these are actually from the 19th century. And you can see that carried through to other pottery pieces as well, but it's particularly clear on tiles, where it looks a lot like Rochester Cathedral. There's a wonderful tiled floor there, like the red and umber ones on the base. And there they deliberately made them slightly imperfect, because man is imperfect. So each tile had a slight error or imperfection or slight lack of correct alignment. Here's some beautiful glassware and pottery, each one slightly arranged by the era or the inspiration. Here we can see, with the discovery of the winged gods that are on display at the British Museum, there was a brief dalliance with the Assyrian art as a source. You see much more of Egyptian inspired work, particularly when Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb. Here, this gallery at the end is all modern in speech marks. 20th century pottery, glass and metalware. Particularly you see the crossover between American and European traditions. And in the corner there's a very interesting cabinet of some lovely Art Deco pieces, and then through to the post-war era with some interesting pieces of communist pottery art from around the world. You see the rather brutalist and stark style of the communist countries, along with some rather oddly shaped vases there. And then technology affecting style in terms of the layout and shape and patterns. Here's some modern British pieces. We're back out into the 18th century. Some lovely quaint vases and pots. That's gorgeous jewellery and silverware over here, and this cabinet's full of Jewish inspired items. Tiles with the seasons, trinkets, and a lot of work here from France and to a degree Germany. I'd say the French potters are better represented here than Meissen. In the centre of the gallery there, beautiful classical style statue, which is very much in keeping. A lot of this work has classical inspiration. Hidden away in that cabinet on the right is a tube of millefiori. It's 1,000 flowers. You see it particularly in Murano, where you see the beautiful flower pattern baked into the glass, and it's actually made by making that tube there. Just an interesting piece, the little teapot there with the cabbage design that I was pointing at. It's a very classic design from Midlands potters in particular, and particularly the cauliflower and the strawberry pattern were very common for many people, not just the upper classes that some of the finer porcelain here would have been made for, but also just an interesting decorative piece when they were first coming out with moulding. Some good cameos here. These aren't actually jasperware. If you look at the blue there, it's not biscuit glaze, it's glazed slick. Here, this piece here, there's the pattern on the left, which is slightly earlier, which is using slip for decoration, which I must admit I've never really liked. It sort of works where you have that marbling effect for the owl, but it always looks a little bit overwhelming. For most, I'm not too keen. But next to it was some interesting Italian pieces, which reminds me, if you walk around the streets of Florence, you still see shops today with very similar designs of very Renaissance inspired art on everyday items. And there's all sorts of decorative pieces, beautiful astrolabe, some lovely metalwork here from scientific applications, along with beautiful vases and bowls and pewters. Really lovely collection. Here, I can't say I'd want a bowl with a snake in the middle of my table in 3D, but I guess it was a la vogue at one time. Beautiful armour here. You can see it looks like a conquistador's helmet, along with some intricate glassware, some Italian pottery. Over here, some Cypriot Orthodox icons. Really gorgeous pieces. And then next cabinet over, some later pottery, quite naive designs, along with the Italian Renaissance inspired beautiful plates with very rich colours. I can't say I've ever had a kitchen which would suit these, but they are very pretty. And some earlier pieces. And there's cabinet after cabinet, but we're flipping through them fairly quickly, making our way to the next room. Fascinating. Very good examples. Here is Cromwell's death mask. Cromwell was the High Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, kind of king without a crown. When he died, there was the Restoration. Charles II was invited back to Britain, and he was actually dug up and hung at Tyburn as a traitor. Posthumously executed. I guess he was lucky he wasn't hung, drawn and quartered, but it wouldn't have been as effective since he was already dead. But when he was, there was a death mask made of him, and it's in the British Museum, along with some religious work here, some reliquaries, and here in the centre, one of the most famous pieces in the British Museum, the Lewis chess set. This beautiful walrus ivory that's been carved into intricate and expressive designs. The queen looks like she's about to cry. The bishop looks deep in thought. The knights have very elaborate armour. This is a slightly witty interpretation of the dress of the day as a chess set, and definitely one of the must-see pieces in the British Museum. Here, some lovely medieval floor tiles. You can see an interesting design where it's made as 5 pieces, so that you have the central, almost like a shield boss, with the key design, and then there's ornamentation in the floor around the side. Here we have a cabinet of the Islamic influence of art on Europe, particularly Spain. And you can see these gorgeous elephant ivory carved horns made from tusks of elephants. Along with, there's an astrolabe and some beautiful blown glass. Here, intricate metal work and filigree. Here's Byzantine work, and the influence of Byzantine art on Europe. Various boxes and cabinets and coins and items from around Europe. Really all lovely pieces. Knights and chivalry. A small altar, almost like a double triptych with finely carved religious designs, and a bishop's crozier here. Very beautiful example. You don't really get to see them close up very often. Occasionally you see a cathedral which has one on display, and I believe there's some in the V&A on the ground floor. If you go down the right hand side past the Renaissance metalwork and sculpture work. It's a seal of state. It's a ring that you can press on wax for the king to seal. Here's the sword of state. This is actually the original sword. This was made in Germany, in Passau, and the inscription is in Lombardic. Latin and Low German inscriptions are also very vague and hard to see on there. But this was made for Edward V of England somewhere between 1473 and 1483. Displayed on a table is a large hoard of coins from the War of the Roses with very good explanation of the various monarchs shown. And a gorgeous chalice here. A lot of interesting items in this room, covering here this very admired, a lot of people were paying attention to this precursor to a violin, I guess is how I would describe it, along with horns and weapons. This is actually the strap that was used for holding the horn. Some rather intriguing metalwork and tiles. You don't see the intricacy in that musical instrument on the video, but it is completely pierced with small holes and carving. It's almost carved as an instrument rather than shaped as an instrument. It's like one block of wood carved into a single item of beauty, which sadly on the camera looks fairly flat, but it's very much not. If you think of Japanese netsuko, it's very much like the best jade examples. Here more seals of state and power, along with a pottery alphabet. And here, this vase isn't an oddly shaped water vase. This vase is for burying in the wall of a church to create an echo chamber to enhance the acoustics of a church. I don't think I've ever seen one before. Next room over is clocks and watches, and it is a sumptuous display. Some wonderful grandfather clocks, very elaborate 1920s clock there. Some wooden clocks where the clock is made entirely out of wood. The cogs and the mechanisms are not metalwork at all. Some more modern pieces. A few really lovely mantelpiece clocks. I must say the walnut rectangular one on the right I particularly liked. The clock face is so beautifully carved and somehow comes across as understated until you look really closely at the clock face, along with a series of cuckoo clocks, Dutch clocks, grandfather clocks, a very large display of pocket watches, some of the fine examples of pocket watches, particularly from Britain but also from around Europe. And there's an interesting explanation of how clockworking was a very big thing in the UK at one point, but then as it moved over to Switzerland, they really couldn't compete, and they had a last hurrah where they tried to take back the market with some technical advances. If you like clocks and watches, and these are gorgeous watches, these aren't the sort of things you buy at Argos, then I would recommend check out the Science Museum. I believe it's the part 2 video. It's on the second floor at the Science Museum, and there's a wonderful collection that's on loan from the Watchmaking Guild, and you see particularly fine examples. If anything, from British clockmaking, it's a slightly better collection than the British Museum. But here at the British Museum, it's the whole of Europe that's really covered by these clocks. And this is another one of those must-see items that often features on postcards. It is an automaton that's also a clock of a galleon. Ridiculously detailed automaton, because automatons used a lot of clockwork mechanisms. There's a series of automatons here, and in the background you can make out it's almost like a perpetual motion. The ball rolling is the timing mechanism, and every time the ball reaches the end it hits a trigger which flips the plate with the ball, and the ball rolls back down the slope. So the ball is almost like the quartz in a modern quartz clock, and it's intriguing to watch. As you can see, it drew a crowd. But some lovely clock related items. I can't say I'm a clock connoisseur, but when you see the level of artistry and the skill and craft in the cases, the clock faces, the clock mechanisms, you appreciate its beauty. Here, a large pendulum driven clock. As with everything at the British Museum, it's a very interesting and thorough collection. All world-class, excellent examples. Here a lot more of the automata clocks, and very different styles, like the cow, and the rather spectacular, it says. I think that's the right adjective for that clock. Maybe a little bit much for most houses. And we take a little breather halfway down here. You can see over the Grand Court, which you can see what a beautiful addition it is, drawing the gallery together. You can gaze down on the marble with the ever shifting shades of the pattern of the glass roof which ripples over above the main court. Now I make our way up to the Mitsubishi Gallery. There's a series of galleries, one above each other, running the length of the back of the building. Japanese on the top floor, underneath that is Chinese and Indian, and there's a small Korean gallery at the end here, which is quite interesting. On the way up you pass a series of modern Japanese art. Here a small cabinet of very intricate netsuko. These are small knobs that you put on the end of the cords of a kimono. They're decorative jewellery almost, often made of jade or bone or ivory. Inside the Japanese gallery, 1920s Buddhist statue, recreation of a Japanese tea house. And if you at all like Japanese art and culture, this room is very interesting. Striking pieces of simple and quite elaborately carved pottery, ironware, probably iron bell. And very old, these items. A lot of these are much older than you might think. Some grave goods here from, this is the picture in the middle is the burial mound. They look like keyholes in the centre of a lake. They're the burial mounds in Kyoto of the rulers of Yamato. After 1,000 years, these are still off limits for archaeologists and researchers, but there's some beautiful examples from early Japanese graves of emperors and rulers, and also of the common people items from their tombs. Really beautiful stand there for a bowl. Piece that's missing, not sure what was there. There's some masks and some pagodas, the mini versions of the pagodas and Buddhist statuary. Here the obligatory samurai armour. What looks like clubs at the back are actually transporting carriers to transport your samurai swords, along with a saddle, a full samurai outfit. At the back there's a helmet which is in the shape of a sea monster, another samurai sword, and all the different components from the knife guard and the hilt. A box there for transporting their outfits. Luckily they didn't have to wear them all the time. Certainly a very good gallery here. Lovely outfit. Beautiful examples of porcelain. I think much better than the gallery used to be when I was younger. I remember the Asian galleries weren't as complete and large. There's an excellent collection here of Japanese art, drawings, paintings, pottery with paintings on. You can see the way that the art was refined over time. This wonderful kimono with an elaborate Japanese art design on it, along with scrolls here. That's people visiting the emperor, and landscapes, beautiful vistas from around Japan. Really interesting collection. There's a lot of Buddhist art, representation of the Buddha, and also demon spirits, temple guardians, all sorts of medium material used for creating them, and you can see the level of artistry that's gone into them. I love this, sitting on the lotus flower with his arms flailing, and prayer bells, wheels, all very well selected items. I think the Mitsubishi Gallery's been here for about 20 years, and certainly, as I said, much better than I remember as a child, where I always thought the Asian galleries were a little bit of a disappointment. I think they've really plugged the gaps in those in the last couple of decades, and this Mitsubishi Gallery is excellent. I love this piece. It's small flowers or leaves individually made and then wrapped together almost like a wreath at the top of the bowl, and all very plain. There's a plainness to some of the porcelains here, very intricate designs of metal animals, a carp, a fish, a snake, praying mantis, elements of sword, gods, and very much interesting piece on the right. I don't even know how to describe it. It's like a naturalistic curve made out of small plates of metal. It looks like an animate object, like a wave, a flow. And that fish looks rather creepy. Along with some more modern glass work, all with a little Japanese twist. Beautiful images of nature in painting and pottery. And a very particularly Japanese style to a lot of these pieces. And it's all displayed in a slightly austere manner. Maybe it's in keeping with the Japanese gallery, that it's not as crowded and cramped as a lot of the gallery's display cases are in the museum. And I love the series of Japanese landscape and natural forms. You can see the link between the ink and paint, drawings, pottery, metalware, clay work, all sharing a common theme, almost not evolving into different forms of art like you'd see in Europe with art, but refining a very Japanese style. And we've still got Korea, China and India to come in the Asian galleries, so we'll have to move on fairly swiftly. Before we move on to the other Asian galleries, we're just going to take a little stroll quite quickly through this gallery of drawings and prints. And there's some very beautiful drawings here. There's some Reynolds. British Museum actually holds 50,000 prints and drawings. Maybe there's 100 on display here, but they are some of the finest examples, and by particularly fine and famous artists. And the delicacy of many of them, they really are quite beautiful. It doesn't at all do justice to it on camera. Just on camera it's just a blur of sketches, but they really are beautiful pieces, excellent works of art from the last 400 years of drawings and sketches and prints. And we're skipping the majority because you really can't do justice to them, but you can see here some lovely ink work, and we're going to see one of the famous pieces in the museum, a very large sketch by Leonardo da Vinci. I remember many years ago there used to be a gallery in the British Museum with the sketches for the Queen's tapestries, and those have been moved, I believe, possibly to Buckingham Palace or to Windsor. And if you really want to enjoy that, you've got to go to the British Museum. But the collection concludes with some much more modern prints. Again, excellent examples, and we start to see the first use of colour in these prints. I love the one on the left there, and the right, the views of London. And ahead of us is a very elaborate print of a quarry. I'm not sure I'd want it on my wall, but it's certainly a beautiful piece of drawing. Then we're through into the Korean galleries. Very brief here. I think lovely examples of Korean art and some very old pieces and some very simple, plain, austere moon bowls, which I particularly liked. And some lovely jewellery, grave guardians, temple guardians, interesting pieces from some very old tombs in Korea. There's some good explanations of the eras of Korean history, which is a topic that isn't generally covered here. These are from the unification of the three kingdoms, and you see the introduction of Buddhist art and some quite elaborate pieces. Beautiful pottery is always a very similar earthenware I see with Korean art. You see these lovely demons from a temple, very large striking pieces, along with writing and printing, and quite interestingly these examples of movable and fixed print predate Caxton and Gutenberg. Here a more modern piece of printing. So a lovely gallery which I've had to skip through because I'm determined to not do a part 4 to the British Museum. Really, if you want to see the British Museum that much, you have to go and visit. Lovely vases here, or urns, and there is a reconstruction of a Korean house all laid out, some lovely fans, and then we're moving through to an excellent room of porcelain and china, very well displayed, great examples. And we're going to be making our way down to the Chinese room, which is a huge collection, quite overwhelming, all laid out by eras and styles, and you can see from very, very old pieces right through to 20th century modern pieces, and you can see both a transition and a change in the style, along with an experimentation and a return to traditional styles. I particularly liked that vase there on my left. I couldn't actually figure out how it was made with the two styles of glaze. The Chinese gallery here, very large, very thorough. Each of the alcoves along this hall is split into a different era of Chinese history, with excellent examples of grave goods, everyday items. You see we're in the centre there. If you look down what looks like a large well, you can see to the rear entrance hall of the museum, and down the other end is the Indian gallery, the last one we'll be visiting at the British Museum. But here some very old pottery. These are about 4,000 years old, some of them, and various grave goods, vases, bowls for libations, incense bowls and burners, decorations, jade discs. Really a large collection. And they point out there, the reason you can see the 3 medals is they point out that the Beijing Olympics, the medals were made to look like these jade discs. And here a beautiful large piece of carved jade which that gentleman was admiring. Then through into the next alcove. We probably won't do all of them. This is grave goods from ancient China. There's a very large collection by era of Chinese, particularly grave goods and burial goods, and items from shrines and religious practices. And really excellent pieces. When you see them, you just don't think quite how old a lot of these pieces are. They look like they're 100 years old or more. Here you really get a feel for just how old Chinese civilization is. And items of clothing and more burial goods and shrine ware. We're going to skip through a little bit of the gallery because there really is just so much. Maybe do one side. This is a chariot from a chariot burial. Here we see the introduction, after this beautiful bronze bell, the introduction of Buddhism to China and the change in the style. It's an evolution of the style from these naturalistic figures, still very beautiful, intricate, crafted items showing real skill. But we start to see the introduction of Buddhism and the growth of a very different China post. This is still in the Han Empire, but as we move through, remember at this point we've reached between 200 BC and 200 AD, so everything before that was about 1000 to 5000 BC, and here we see Buddhism entering China and the evolution of Confucianism and what we'd think of more as modern Chinese theology. Here the arch to a burial, some wonderful wooden figures, and there's the Buddhist thinkers and philosophers, and also there's the temple guardians and demons. Yeah, very elegant. There's a different style to Chinese Buddhist art. It's very interesting. We skipped through a few centuries there. There were some beautiful Buddhist figures at the end of the hall, but unfortunately they just really didn't come off in the camera. And here we see a series of seals. These are small seals, and on the bottom, on the base, is almost like a signature that can be stamped with a seal. Some old mirrors and bronze vessels and vases. It's beautiful porcelain. Through here into Ming. Really wonderful old pieces, and they really don't look as old as they are. Sorry, Tang. In the centre, these wonderful figures, the very famous stylisation of camels and horses and various figures. You can see the different scale for the seniority. We're going to glaze over the rest of the Chinese gallery. If you're at all interested in Chinese history, then this gallery is well worth a visit. There's an excellent collection of Chinese historical items from the Stone Age through the Tan and Han and Ming empires, right the way through to some communist prints of Mao, and some modern pottery, modern pieces showing a cultural lineage back to a lot of those earlier pieces, and certainly some interesting pieces from the royal court, from burials, and from everyday life. Yes, an excellent Chinese collection. And right next door is the Indian collection, which again we're not going to have enough time to really show you its scale. But here we see a figure of Ganesh. Yeah. And the other half of the gallery, the same as the Chinese, is a collection of Indian history from prehistory, the arrival of Buddhism, well, the birth of Buddhism really. And there's also good coverage of Nepal, Bhutan, and you see pieces from different temples, shrines, eras. Really beautiful carving. And there's a wonderful selection of carvings from different gods and figures and temples. Right the way through on the other side, sort of diagonally across from here, there's the original catalogue. The idea of cataloguing and understanding the list of Indian gods was something the British did, because they sort of saw how many there were and they wanted to understand how many there were, and there's an early catalogue of the gods. Beautiful, intricately carved, almost filigree from hard stone. And really a great collection of Indian history, covering a few thousand years of pagan prehistory through Hinduism and Buddhism. And at the back, behind that glass wall, are the remains of a very old temple which was destroyed and had become a quarry. It was just a pile of stones that was used for a quarry, and the remaining pieces were mined out and are now on display. Mainly the drum around the base of the dome, if you've ever been to a Buddhist temple, but really wonderful selection here of devotional items, religious inscriptions and murals and high relief carvings, everyday items. There's a very religious and ritualistic base to the Indian section here. The majority is religious, and each of these alcoves on the blue wall, there's an explanation of where and what you're looking at, because they're all themed by era and region. Beautiful gilding as well as the stonework. Really well worth a visit here. This is up in Nepal and Bhutan. You see everything from masks and figures and shields and weapons. There's an almost life-size statue of Kali, and in the cabinets we just passed a large collection of Sikh history. Here, silverware, a little row of gods there. It's like a travelling companion of gods. I believe it's a tourist item. And some beautiful silverware. Now we're into the British Raj, where obviously the British Museum has quite a large collection from that. That's from the Nicobar Islands. Wonderful sword there. Along with, these are the fuggi down at the bottom, where the word fug comes from. And we're drawing to a close with that wonderful temple I mentioned. These are all carvings from the Amaravati temple. It's founded in 200 BC. It's in what's now Andhra Pradesh in the southeast of India, and it's one of the oldest and most important Buddhist monuments in ancient India, but had fallen out of use, and the stupa has been recreated. There's elements of that dome, and although there is a picture on one wall where you can see what it used to look like, it's small fragments of what remains of a once magnificent monument, really preserved here. There you can see the dome. The drum is the circular bit below the dome, and that's what the majority of the carvings come from. But really beautiful pieces, and I think a fitting end to the British Museum. I hope you've enjoyed these 3 visits that we've made. It is an immense museum, not really comparable with any other in London, or maybe you could say Europe. So well worth a visit. I'd say a must see if you're in London. Please do like and subscribe, and we'll be back with some smaller and less well known museums in the coming weeks.